The sun had barely risen over the private terminal at San Francisco International Airport when the incident that would soon captivate millions began to unfold. The early morning calm was broken by the steady hum of a luxury Gulfstream G650 preparing for departure, its pristine white exterior gleaming under the golden California sunrise. Inside the terminal's exclusive lounge, the flight crew was going through their final preparations, reviewing weather reports and flight plans for their journey to Austin. The lead flight attendant, a veteran with 15 years of experience serving the ultra-wealthy, was arranging the cabin's premium refreshments when she received word that their passenger had arrived. The atmosphere in the terminal shifted subtly as a small entourage entered through the private security checkpoint. Among them was a figure that seemed oddly out of place in the refined environment of private aviation, a man wearing casual attire topped with a bright red baseball cap. At first glance, he appeared to be just another wealthy tech entrepreneur, the kind that frequently passed through these terminals. However, something about his demeanor caught the attention of the ground staff. As the group approached the aircraft, one of the younger ground crew members did a double-take. He'd spent countless hours scrolling through tech news and couldn't shake the feeling that he recognized the passenger. The red cap, typically associated with political statements, seemed at odds with the usual attire of their clientele. The lead flight attendant greeted the group with her usual professional courtesy, but she couldn't help noticing the tension among her colleagues. The captain, a seasoned aviator who had flown countless VIPs, emerged from the cockpit to personally welcome the passengers, a courtesy typically reserved for their most distinguished clients. The passenger in the red cap was busy typing on his phone, barely acknowledging the crew's presence. His security detail, however, was alert and professional, scanning the environment with practiced efficiency. As they began the boarding process, whispers started circulating among the ground crew. The word spread quickly. They believed their passenger was none other than the controversial tech billionaire known for his unconventional approach to both business and public life. The flight attendant maintained her composure, though her mind was racing. In all her years of service, she'd learned that assumptions about passengers could lead to awkward situations. She'd served celebrities, politicians, and business leaders who valued their privacy above all else. Yet something about this morning felt different. As the passenger settled into one of the leather seats, his security team arranged themselves strategically throughout the cabin. The flight attendant noticed he kept the red cap on, pulling it slightly lower over his eyes as he continued working on his phone. The cabin's atmosphere grew increasingly tense as the crew prepared for departure. What happened next would become the subject of countless social media posts and news articles. As the engines began their initial warm-up sequence, the captain received an urgent message from the tower. There was a problem with the flight manifest, they said. Something about security protocols and proper identification verification. The lead flight attendant observed as the captain approached the passenger, maintaining a professional demeanor despite the unusual circumstances. The conversation that followed was brief but intense. The passenger, still focused on his phone, seemed irritated by the interruption. His security team shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "Sir," the captain began, his voice steady but firm, "we've encountered a situation that requires our immediate attention." The passenger looked up, his expression hidden beneath the brim of his cap. The captain continued, explaining that there appeared to be a discrepancy with the flight documentation that needed to be resolved before takeoff. The response from the passenger was unexpected. Rather than showing concern or cooperation, he launched into a series of rapid-fire tweets, his fingers flying over his phone's keyboard. The cabin crew exchanged worried glances as the situation began to escalate. The security team leader attempted to mediate, speaking in hushed tones with both the captain and his client. Meanwhile, word of the delay had reached the terminal, where a small crowd of employees had gathered, their phones discreetly capturing snippets of the unfolding drama. As tensions mounted, the passenger's voice grew louder, carrying through the cabin. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he demanded, finally looking up from his phone. The captain stood his ground, explaining that regardless of the passenger's identity, proper protocols had to be followed. The next few moments seemed to unfold in slow motion. The passenger, clearly unused to being challenged, rose from his seat. The red cap, which had been the subject of so much speculation, caught the morning light streaming through the cabin windows. His security team tensed, unsure of how to handle this unexpected development. What nobody in the cabin realized was that this incident was about to become much more than a simple disagreement over documentation. Outside the aircraft, phones were already lighting up with notifications. Someone had leaked information about the delay, and social media was beginning to buzz with speculation about what was really happening aboard the luxury private jet. The lead flight attendant, drawing on years of experience in handling difficult situations, attempted to defuse the tension. She approached with an offer of refreshments and a suggestion to resolve the matter in the privacy of the terminal. But the passenger was beyond such pleasantries now. His phone had begun buzzing incessantly with notifications, and his expression darkened as he scrolled through what appeared to be breaking news about the very incident they were currently experiencing. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, what had started as a routine private flight was transforming into a story that would capture the attention of millions. The crew, the security team, and even the ground staff were about to become unwitting participants in a drama that would raise questions about privilege, protocol, and the power of social media in modern society. The red cap, which had seemed like such a simple detail at first, was about to become the centerpiece of countless headlines and social media debates. But in that moment, as the situation teetered on the edge of chaos, nobody aboard the Gulfstream G650 could have predicted just how far-reaching the consequences of this morning's events would become. The situation aboard the Gulfstream G650 was rapidly spiraling beyond anyone's control. As the morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac, the private terminal's usually peaceful atmosphere had transformed into a hub of barely contained chaos. Airport security personnel had begun to gather at a discreet distance, responding to calls from concerned ground staff. The passenger security team was now facing an impossible situation. Their training had prepared them for physical threats, not this delicate dance of protocols and public relations. Their client, still standing and increasingly agitated, had begun a rapid-fire series of social media posts that were already sending shockwaves through the internet. "Sir," the head of security attempted to intervene, his voice low and measured, "perhaps we should consider alternative arrangements." But his words seemed to evaporate in the tense cabin air. The passenger, his red cap now slightly askew, was fully immersed in what he saw as an assault on his personal freedom. Outside the aircraft, a small crowd of airport employees had gathered, trying to appear busy with their regular duties while stealing glances at the luxury jet. Among them was a young maintenance worker who had been live-streaming the entire incident through his phone, cleverly hidden behind a clipboard. His feed had already caught the attention of several news outlets. The lead flight attendant, watching the situation unravel, remembered similar incidents from her years of service. But this was different. The combination of social media, a high-profile passenger, and the politically charged atmosphere had created a perfect storm. She noticed the captain speaking quietly into his radio, likely communicating with airport authorities. What happened next would later be described by witnesses as a masterclass in how not to handle a PR crisis. The passenger, frustrated by what he saw as unnecessary delays, began a loud phone call that echoed through the cabin. "Do you know what's happening right now?" his voice boomed. "They're trying to ground me because of a hat." A hat. The irony of his words being broadcast through his own phone speaker seemed lost on him. The airport's operations manager, a veteran of handling difficult situations, arrived at the scene. She had dealt with celebrities, politicians, and billionaires throughout her career, but this situation required an especially delicate touch. As she boarded the aircraft, the tension in the cabin was palpable. "Sir," she began, her voice carrying the weight of authority tempered with diplomacy, "I understand there's been some confusion about the flight documentation." She held a tablet in her hands, displaying what appeared to be official protocols. "If we could just step into the terminal to resolve this matter." The passenger's response was unexpected. Instead of the anticipated outburst, he suddenly became very quiet, his fingers moving rapidly across his phone screen. The security team exchanged worried glances. They had seen this behavior before, and it usually preceded a major social media storm. True to their concerns, within minutes, the story had exploded online. The passenger's millions of followers were already mobilizing, flooding social media with hashtags supporting their idol. The narrative was spinning rapidly out of control, with conflicting accounts of what was really happening aboard the private jet. The operations manager, realizing the situation was now far beyond a simple documentation issue, attempted to regain control. "We value all our clients' privacy and comfort," she stated firmly, "but safety protocols must be followed without exception." Her words seemed to hang in the air, competing with the steady ping of incoming notifications from various phones in the cabin. Meanwhile, the ground crew had noticed something concerning. Several cars had begun arriving at the private terminal's parking area. They appeared to be news vans, their satellite dishes distinctive even from a distance. The story was no longer contained within the digital realm, traditional media was now converging on the scene. The passenger security team huddled together, discussing options in hushed tones. Their client's unpredictability had put them in an unprecedented situation. They were trained to protect him from physical threats, but how could they protect him from himself? The head of security made several urgent phone calls, presumably to their company's PR team. Inside the cabin, the lead flight attendant noticed a subtle shift in the passenger's demeanor. The initial anger seemed to be transforming into something else, perhaps amusement. He had begun recording the scene himself, providing running commentary to his followers. The red cap, which had started this whole incident, was now being used as a prop in his impromptu social media performance. The captain, who had remained remarkably composed throughout the ordeal, received another message from the tower. Weather conditions were changing, and their departure window was closing. If they didn't resolve this situation soon, weather would become yet another factor in this increasingly complex equation. As if on cue, dark clouds began gathering on the horizon, their appearance almost too perfectly timed with the drama unfolding on the ground. The operations manager's tablet buzzed with urgent messages from her superiors. This situation had escalated far beyond a simple private jet departure. It was now a full-blown media crisis. The security team's phones simultaneously lit up with alerts. Their clients' latest social media posts had gone viral, with millions of interactions pouring in from around the globe. The story was being picked up by major news networks, each adding their own spin to the events. The simple matter of flight documentation had transformed into a broader debate about privilege, power, and the role of social media in modern society. As the morning wore on, it became increasingly clear that this story was far from over. The passenger, his red cap now a symbol of defiance, showed no signs of backing down. The crew, the security team, and the airport staff found themselves caught in a situation that was part reality show, part social media phenomenon, and part cautionary tale about the intersection of wealth, influence, and protocol in the digital age. The lead flight attendant, watching storm clouds gather both literally and metaphorically, couldn't help but wonder how this would all end. Little did she know, the most shocking developments were yet to come. The private terminal's glass windows reflected the growing media circus outside as the situation entered its third hour. The story had evolved far beyond its initial scope, taking on a life of its own across social media platforms and news networks. Inside the Gulfstream G650, the atmosphere had shifted from tense confrontation to something more complex and unpredictable. The passenger, still wearing his controversial red cap, had settled into what appeared to be a makeshift command center in his leather seat. Multiple phones lay spread across the table in front of him, each screen displaying different social media feeds and news coverage of the unfolding event. His security team watched nervously as he orchestrated what could only be described as a digital theater. "You know what's fascinating?" he suddenly announced to no one in particular, his fingers dancing across one of his devices. "This is already the top trending topic worldwide." There was an unmistakable note of satisfaction in his voice that made the lead flight attendant pause as she restocked the refreshment cart. Outside, the weather continued to deteriorate. Dark clouds loomed closer, and the first drops of rain began to strike the aircraft's windows. The operations manager, who had maintained her position near the cabin door, received another urgent update on her tablet. Weather radar showed an approaching storm system that would make departure impossible within the next hour. The ground crew's attention was divided between the worsening weather and the growing media presence. News vans had multiplied, their satellite dishes creating a forest of metal and technology in the private terminal's parking area. More concerning were the small groups of supporters who had somehow discovered the location and begun to gather at the terminal's perimeter. Inside the cabin, the security team's leader received a call that made him visibly pale. "Sir," he addressed his client, moving closer to speak privately, "our PR team is reporting that this situation has evolved beyond our control. They're strongly advising that we need to consider an exit strategy." The passenger looked up from his phones, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Exit strategy," he repeated, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. "Why would I want to exit? This is getting interesting." He gestured to one of his screens, where the viewer count on his latest live stream was climbing into the millions. The captain, who had been in constant communication with the tower, finally emerged from the cockpit with news that would add yet another layer to the unfolding drama. "Sir," he announced, addressing both the passenger and the operations manager, "we've just received word that this weather system is more severe than initially forecast. If we don't make a decision within the next 40 minutes, we'll be grounded regardless of the documentation situation." This announcement seemed to catch the passenger's attention. For the first time since the standoff began, he appeared to be genuinely concerned about something beyond his social media performance. His security team seized this moment of clarity to present a series of options they'd been developing. Meanwhile, the lead flight attendant noticed something that others seemed to have missed. The passenger's constant phone use and live streaming had drawn attention away from a subtle but significant detail. His hands had begun to shake slightly when he reached for his water glass, and his forehead glistened with a fine sheen of sweat despite the cabin's comfortable temperature. The operations manager, too, had picked up on these signs. In her 20 years of handling high-stress situations, she'd learned to read the subtle cues that often preceded a turning point. She moved closer to the flight attendant, speaking in a whisper, "How long has he been showing signs of stress?" The situation outside was evolving rapidly. The gathering crowds had grown large enough to attract the attention of local law enforcement. Police vehicles could be seen arriving at the terminal's perimeter, their lights flashing silently in the growing darkness of the storm. Inside the cabin, a new dynamic was emerging. The passenger's social media arsenal, which had seemed so powerful just hours ago, was beginning to show its limitations. The battery indicators on his devices were dropping into critical levels, and the storm was beginning to affect the cellular signals that had been his lifeline to his digital audience. One of the security team members, who had been monitoring various news feeds, approached with information that would change the entire trajectory of the morning's events. He leaned in close to his client, speaking in hushed tones, but the lead flight attendant's trained ear caught fragments of the conversation, something about unexpected consequences and unforeseen complications. The passenger's reaction to whatever news he received was subtle but significant. His usually confident demeanor flickered, just for a moment, revealing something underneath that none of the observers had expected to see: uncertainty. The red cap, which had been the catalyst for this entire situation, was adjusted nervously. The operations manager, sensing a shift in the atmosphere, stepped forward with what would prove to be a pivotal question. "Sir," she began, her voice carrying a note of genuine concern rather than authority, perhaps this would be a good time to discuss those alternative arrangements we mentioned earlier? The storm outside had intensified, its darkness matching the growing complexity of the situation within the cabin. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the faces of the gathered crowd and media personnel through the terminal windows. The thunder that followed seemed to underscore the gravity of the moment. What happened next would later be described by witnesses as a masterclass in the art of unexpected turns. The passenger, who had spent the morning crafting a narrative of defiance and digital triumph, suddenly fell silent. His phones, arranged before him like digital playing cards, displayed a cascade of notifications that seemed to tell a story very different from the one he had been promoting. The lead flight attendant, who had seen countless dramas unfold in private jet cabins over her career, recognized the signs of an impending revelation. Something had changed in the past few minutes, something significant enough to pierce the carefully constructed facade that had dominated the morning's events. As rain pounded against the aircraft's windows and lightning continued to illuminate the darkened sky, all those present in the cabin felt the unmistakable sensation that they were about to witness yet another unexpected turn in this already extraordinary story. The truth, as they would soon discover, was far more complex than anyone had imagined. The revelation that changed everything came not with a bang, but with the soft ping of an incoming email. The passenger's expression shifted as he read the message on his last functioning phone, the others having finally succumbed to drained batteries. The storm outside had reached its full intensity, battering the Gulfstream G650 with sheets of rain that reduced visibility to mere feet. The lead flight attendant, who had been discreetly observing the situation while maintaining her professional duties, noticed the sudden change in the passenger's demeanor. The confident, almost theatrical persona he'd maintained throughout the morning had cracked, revealing something entirely unexpected underneath: vulnerability. "I need to make a call," he announced abruptly, rising from his seat. His security team exchanged glances, surprised by the sudden shift in his tone. Gone was the combative energy that had fueled the morning's social media storm. In its place was something that sounded almost like resignation. The operations manager, who had been fielding increasingly urgent messages from her superiors, watched as the passenger moved toward the private cabin at the rear of the aircraft. His red cap, which had been the symbol of this entire confrontation, was now held loosely in his hands rather than worn proudly on his head. Outside, the media circus had reached fever pitch despite the deteriorating weather. News helicopters hovered at a distance, their cameras attempting to peer through the storm clouds. The gathering crowd of supporters had grown large enough that additional police units had been called in to maintain order. None of them knew that the story they thought they were covering was about to take an unexpected turn. The security team's leader received another call, this one causing him to step into urgent conversation with his colleagues. The lead flight attendant caught fragments of their discussion, something about market implications and board meeting. Whatever was happening, it went far beyond the simple issue of flight documentation that had initially triggered this standoff. Lightning illuminated the cabin in stark bursts as the passenger emerged from the private compartment. His face, briefly visible in the electric light, showed signs of a man grappling with decisions that went far beyond whether to wear a controversial cap on a private flight. "I need to make a statement," he announced, addressing the operations manager directly for the first time in hours. The change in his approach was so dramatic that even the captain, who had been monitoring the situation from the cockpit doorway, stepped forward to listen. What followed would later be analyzed by media experts, business schools, and social media strategists for years to come. The passenger, who had spent the morning crafting a narrative of defiance and persecution, began recording what would become one of the most unexpected corporate announcements in recent history. Sometimes, he began, looking directly into his phone's camera, what appears to be a stand on principle is actually a distraction from more important matters. The security team tensed, unsure where this was heading. This morning's events have been portrayed as a conflict about personal freedom and corporate protocols. The truth is more complicated. The lead flight attendant watched as he continued his recording, each word seemingly chosen with careful consideration. The storm outside provided a dramatic backdrop to his confession, thunder punctuating key moments as if nature itself was participating in this unexpected turn of events. What he revealed next sent shockwaves through the business world. The documentation issue that had initially grounded the flight was merely a smokescreen. The real story involved a complex web of corporate maneuvering, market dynamics, and a board meeting that was scheduled to take place in Austin that afternoon. The red cap, which had seemed like such a provocative symbol, was revealed to be part of an elaborate distraction. While media attention had been focused on the standoff at the private terminal, larger events had been unfolding in the corporate world. The passengers' company had been involved in crucial negotiations that required absolute secrecy, and the morning's social media spectacle had provided the perfect cover. As he continued his explanation, the operations manager's tablet buzzed with breaking news alerts. Stock markets were reacting to rumors of a major corporate merger. The passengers' live stream, which had begun as an apparent protest against airline protocols, had transformed into one of the most unusual corporate announcements in business history. The security team, now fully aware of the broader context, began coordinating with corporate offices on both coasts. The lead flight attendant noticed that their earlier tension had been replaced by focused efficiency. They had shifted from managing a PR crisis to facilitating a major business transaction. Outside, the storm began to show signs of passing, though the media presence had only grown stronger. The gathering crowd, which had come to support what they thought was a political statement, found themselves unwitting participants in a corporate chess game of the highest stakes. The operations manager, who had maintained her professional composure throughout the morning, allowed herself a small smile of understanding. In her years of handling high-profile clients, she had learned that surface appearances often masked deeper realities. Today's events had proven that principle in spectacular fashion. The passenger, having completed his revelation, finally addressed the documentation issue that had started it all. "I believe," he said, turning to the captain, "we can now proceed with the proper protocols." The red cap, which had caused such controversy, was quietly tucked into his briefcase, its role in the drama now complete. As the storm clouds began to part, allowing the first rays of afternoon sun to pierce through, the true magnitude of the morning's events began to sink in. What had appeared to be a simple clash between a high-profile passenger and airline protocols had been revealed as something far more complex, a carefully orchestrated business maneuver playing out on a global stage. The lead flight attendant, preparing the cabin for their delayed departure, reflected on how appearances could be deceiving. The passenger, now calmly reviewing documents with his security team, bore little resemblance to the confrontational figure who had dominated social media just hours earlier. As the engines finally began their startup sequence, news was already spreading through financial markets about one of the most audacious corporate moves in recent memory. The private terminal staff, the gathered media, and the dispersing crowd were all left to ponder the same question: had they just witnessed a meltdown, a masterpiece of misdirection, or perhaps a bit of both? What no one could deny was that this morning's events had rewritten the rules of corporate communication, crisis management, and social media strategy. As the Gulfstream G650 finally lifted off into the clearing sky, it left behind a story that would be studied, debated, and remembered for years to come. As the Gulfstream G650 cruised at 45,000 feet, the events that had unfolded at the private terminal were already triggering a cascade of reactions across the globe. The lead flight attendant, now serving premium refreshments to a much calmer cabin, observed the passenger and his team as they managed the aftermath of their morning's performance. The aircraft's secure Wi-Fi system had become a command center of sorts, with multiple devices coordinating responses to the explosion of media coverage. The passenger, having shed both his confrontational persona and the infamous red cap, was now fully immersed in what appeared to be a series of high-stakes video conferences. The timing had to be perfect, he explained to someone on his tablet screen, his voice carrying the confident tone of a man who had just pulled off an extraordinary feat. "The market wouldn't have responded the same way if we'd handled this conventionally." His security team, now functioning more like corporate advisors, nodded in agreement as they monitored real-time market reactions on their devices. Back on the ground, the story was evolving in unexpected ways. Social media channels that had been flooded with hashtags supporting the passengers' apparent stand against authority were now buzzing with debates about corporate strategy and market manipulation. Financial analysts were hastily organizing emergency broadcasts to discuss the implications of what was being called the terminal gambit. The operations manager, who had returned to her office at the private terminal, found herself fielding calls from major news networks. They all wanted to know the same thing: had she been aware of the larger game being played? Her diplomatic responses would later be cited in several business school case studies about crisis management and corporate theater. At 35,000 feet, the lead flight attendant noticed something interesting. The passenger, between calls, had begun writing in a small notebook, not typing on a device, but actually writing with a pen. His security team seemed surprised by this analog approach, but maintained their professional reserve as they continued managing the digital storm below. "You know what's remarkable?" the passenger suddenly addressed the cabin at large, looking up from his notebook. Everyone thought they were watching a story about a hat. He smiled, the kind of smile that suggested both amusement and something deeper. "Meanwhile, we just completed one of the largest corporate acquisitions in tech history, and nobody saw it coming until it was done." The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing that they were making good time to Austin despite their delayed departure. The weather system that had added such dramatic backdrop to the morning's events had fully cleared, leaving them with smooth flying conditions. It seemed even nature was now cooperating with the passengers' master plan. Social media channels were evolving into a fascinating study in real-time narrative shift. The same accounts that had been passionately defending the passenger's right to wear what he wanted were now frantically analyzing market implications and corporate strategy. The red cap incident was being reframed as a masterclass in misdirection. The security team's phones buzzed with updates from their corporate offices. Stock prices were moving exactly as planned, the merger announcement was being prepared for official release, and competitors were scrambling to understand how they had missed the signs. One team member showed the passenger a particularly interesting detail: their company's trading volume had hit record levels while everyone was focused on the terminal drama. "The best illusions," the passenger mused, accepting a fresh coffee from the lead flight attendant, "are the ones where everyone voluntarily looks in the wrong direction." He gestured to his briefcase, where the red cap now lay forgotten. "People see what they expect to see, and they react to what they think is important. That's not manipulation, that's human nature." The lead flight attendant, who had served on countless flights with high-profile passengers, realized she was witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't just a business strategy, it was a paradigm shift in how corporate communication could be orchestrated. The traditional press release was dead, long live the manufactured controversy. As they crossed state lines, the digital aftermath continued to unfold below. Market analysts were publishing emergency updates, social media influencers were pivoting their narratives, and news organizations were scrambling to reframe their coverage. The morning's private jet standoff was being transformed into a case study in corporate strategy and media manipulation. The passenger security team had begun compiling preliminary reports on the operation's success. Their phones displayed graphs showing social media engagement levels, stock price movements, and media coverage patterns. Everything had aligned exactly as planned: the controversial cap, the documentation issue, the storm, and even the gathered crowd had all served their purpose in this elaborate corporate theater. "The fascinating thing," the passenger commented, reviewing some of the data, "is that none of it was fake. The cap was real, the documentation issue was real, even my frustration was real. We just..." He paused, searching for the right words, provided a different context for people to interpret events. The lead flight attendant, refreshing beverages, caught fragments of discussions about market psychology, timing strategies, and the art of corporate narrative. The security team was already planning follow-up strategies, knowing that the story would need careful management in the coming days and weeks. As they began their descent into Austin, where another set of corporate chess pieces awaited their arrival, the passenger made one final observation. "Everyone will study this as a business strategy," he said, closing his notebook, "but it's really a story about attention. In an age where everyone is fighting for eyeballs, sometimes the best move is to give people exactly what they expect to see, just not for the reasons they expect." The Gulfstream G650's wheels touched down in Austin under clear skies, a stark contrast to the stormy departure that had captured global attention just hours earlier. As they taxied toward another private terminal, where a new group of corporate players awaited their arrival, the lead flight attendant realized that she had witnessed not just a clever business maneuver, but a fundamental shift in how power and influence operate in the digital age. The red cap, which had sparked such controversy and commentary, remained tucked away in the passenger's briefcase, its role in this corporate drama complete, but its place in business history now secured. As the cabin door opened to admit the Texas heat, the passenger turned to his team with a satisfied smile. "Shall we go make the merger official?" he asked, stepping into the next act of his carefully orchestrated performance. The Austin private terminal buzzed with a different kind of energy than the chaos they'd left behind in San Francisco. Here, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation rather than controversy. A group of sharply dressed executives waited on the tarmac, their expressions a mixture of admiration and apprehension as the Gulfstream G650's doors opened under the bright Texas sun. The lead flight attendant, completing her final cabin checks, watched through the windows as the passenger descended the aircraft stairs with a confidence that seemed to have been restored during the flight. Gone was any trace of the morning's apparent instability. The red cap that had caused such a stir remained tucked away, its role in the drama concluded. "Your performance was remarkable," one of the waiting executives said as they greeted the passenger. "The board is already calling it the most innovative merger strategy they've ever seen." The small group quickly moved toward the terminal building, their conversation barely audible over the dying whine of the jet engines. Inside the terminal's luxurious conference room, a scene was unfolding that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. The passenger, now surrounded by legal teams and corporate advisors, was preparing to formally announce what would soon be recognized as one of the most brilliantly executed corporate takeovers in recent history. "The numbers are exceeding all projections," a financial advisor reported, sliding a tablet across the polished conference table. The market was so focused on the terminal incident that they missed all the usual merger indicators. "We achieved in hours what normally takes weeks of careful market manipulation." The passenger security team had transformed into a sophisticated media response unit. Their phones continuously displayed real-time analytics of social media trends, news coverage, and market reactions. One team member approached with a particularly interesting observation. "Sir, the meme creators are already turning the red cap incident into commentary about corporate misdirection. We're trending in entirely new categories." Outside the terminal, news helicopters had begun arriving, but this time they were met with a different scene. Instead of chaos and controversy, they found a carefully choreographed display of corporate power. Black luxury vehicles formed a precise line, their drivers standing at attention, ready to transport the various players in this corporate drama to their next destinations. The lead flight attendant, who had been asked to remain on standby for the return flight, observed the scene from the terminal's upper level. Her years of experience serving the ultra-wealthy had taught her to read the subtle signs of power dynamics, and what she witnessed now was fascinating. The morning's apparent chaos had given way to a precision that suggested every move had been calculated. The beauty of it, she overheard the passenger explaining to a group of admirers, was that everyone thought they were watching a crisis unfold. In reality, they were watching a corporate revolution in real time. His words carried the weight of someone who had just rewritten the rules of high-stakes business strategy. The terminal staff, who had been briefed on handling the increased media attention, moved with practiced efficiency. Coffee was served in fine china, documents were transferred with discretion, and the entire operation ran with the smoothness of a well-oiled machine. This was corporate theater of a different kind, not the morning's apparent chaos, but a display of precision and power. As the afternoon progressed, news began spreading through financial circles about the true magnitude of what had been accomplished. The Passengers Company hadn't just engineered a merger, they had fundamentally changed the way such deals could be executed in the age of social media and constant surveillance. Think about it, the Passenger addressed the gathered executives, his voice carrying across the conference room. In an era where every corporate move is analyzed, predicted, and priced into the market before it happens, we created the perfect smokescreen. Everyone was so busy debating about a hat that they missed the largest tech merger of the year. The security team's leader approached with a new set of analytics. Social media sentiment was shifting rapidly as the full story emerged. What had started as a narrative about personal freedom and corporate rules had evolved into discussions about the nature of perception and reality in modern business. The Red Cap incident was being studied in real time by business schools and media analysts worldwide. Outside, the Texas heat shimmered off the tarmac as more private jets arrived, carrying board members and key stakeholders for the merger's final phase. Each arrival added another layer to the orchestrated display of corporate power, a sharp contrast to the morning's apparent disorder. The lead flight attendant noticed something interesting as she prepared for the eventual return flight. The passenger, between signing crucial documents and giving brief statements to selected media outlets, had begun collecting copies of various newspapers. "These will be interesting artifacts someday," he commented to no one in particular. The last headlines about a story that wasn't what it seemed. As the afternoon wore on, the true artistry of the morning's events became increasingly clear. The passenger hadn't just created a diversion, he had crafted a narrative so compelling that it had provided perfect cover for one of the most significant corporate moves in recent history. The Red Cap incident would be studied for years to come, not as a story about private jet protocols, but as a masterclass in attention manipulation and corporate strategy. The terminal's conference room had become a command center for managing the merger's final stages. Lawyers reviewed documents, PR teams crafted announcements, and financial advisors monitored market reactions in real time. The passenger moved through it all with the air of someone who had just demonstrated a new kind of corporate mastery. "The next few hours are crucial," he addressed his team. "We've changed the game, but now we need to define how this story is told." His words carried the weight of someone who understood that in the modern business world, narrative control was often more valuable than traditional corporate assets. As the sun began its descent over Austin, casting long shadows across the private terminal's expansive windows, the full impact of the day's events was still unfolding. The morning's apparent crisis had been revealed as a carefully orchestrated performance, but its implications for corporate strategy and media manipulation were only beginning to be understood. The lead flight attendant, preparing for what would undoubtedly be an equally interesting return flight, reflected on how appearances could be deceiving. The day's events had proven that in a world of instant communication and constant scrutiny, sometimes the boldest move was to give everyone something obvious to watch while the real story unfolded in plain sight. As evening approached in Austin, the private terminal had transformed into what some were already calling the war room of the future. Multiple screens displayed real-time data streams, showing everything from global market reactions to social media sentiment analysis. The passenger, who had orchestrated the day's extraordinary events, stood at the center of it all, watching as his morning's performance continued to reshape the business landscape. "We're seeing unprecedented engagement patterns," reported one of the data analysts, gesturing to a series of complex graphs. "The story is evolving exactly as predicted, from controversy to revelation to revolution." The security team, now fully integrated with the corporate communications unit, nodded in agreement as they monitored the global response. The lead flight attendant, still on standby for the return flight, observed a fascinating transformation in the terminal's atmosphere. The initial excitement of the merger announcement had given way to something deeper, a growing recognition that they had witnessed not just a successful business deal, but the birth of a new corporate methodology. The fascinating part, the passenger explained to a group of senior executives, isn't what we did, it's what everyone else did for us. He pulled up a series of news headlines on a nearby screen. Every tweet, every angry post, every speculation about the red cap controversy, it all served to obscure the real story. We didn't just create a distraction, we created an alternate reality that everyone willingly inhabited. Outside the terminal, the media presence had evolved. The morning's chaotic crowd of reporters had been replaced by a more serious group of business journalists and financial analysts. They stood in organized clusters, broadcasting live updates about what was rapidly being hailed as the most innovative corporate merger strategy of the digital age. The security team's leader approached with a tablet displaying a new set of analytics. "Sir, the academic response is beginning to roll in. 3 major business schools have already announced plans for case studies about today's events. They're calling it the Red Cap Revolution in corporate strategy." Inside the terminal's main conference room, a team of legal experts was putting the final touches on the merger documentation. The atmosphere was charged with a sense of historical significance. Everyone present seemed aware that they were participating in a moment that would be studied and analyzed for years to come. The key was understanding attention dynamics in the digital age, the passenger explained to a particularly interested board member. Everyone thinks the challenge is getting attention. The real art is in directing it exactly where you want it to go. He paused, a slight smile playing at his corners of his mouth. Or more precisely, where you don't want it to go. The lead flight attendant noticed something subtle but significant. Throughout the terminal, people were unconsciously mimicking the passenger's calm, controlled demeanor. The frantic energy of a typical corporate merger had been replaced by something almost zen-like, as if everyone was trying to match the mastermind's level of composure. As night fell over Austin, the terminal's large windows reflected the glow of dozens of screens and devices. The passengers' team had begun compiling preliminary data on the day's impact across various metrics: market movements, social media engagement, news coverage patterns, and even meme generation rates. The results were staggering. "We didn't just complete a merger," the passenger announced to his assembled team. "We've demonstrated a new way of operating in an age of total transparency. Sometimes the best place to hide is in plain sight, under the brightest spotlight you can find." His words were being transcribed in real time by several assistants, already aware of their historical significance. The security team's phones buzzed with updates from their corporate offices worldwide. Stock prices had stabilized exactly as planned, competitors were still scrambling to understand what had happened, and social media continued to evolve the narrative in fascinating ways. The Red Cap incident was being simultaneously discussed as a brilliant corporate strategy and a commentary on the nature of truth in the digital age. The real innovation, the passenger continued, now addressing a group of eager young executives, wasn't in the merger itself. It was in understanding that in today's world, the obvious story is always assumed to be hiding something. So we gave everyone exactly what they expected: a controversial billionaire making a scene. And while they were all congratulating themselves for seeing through that, we accomplished something far more significant. The lead flight attendant, refreshing coffee cups for the various groups huddled around screens and documents, overheard fragments of conversations that sounded more like philosophy seminars than business discussions. People weren't just talking about market strategies and stock prices, they were debating the nature of reality, perception, and truth in the modern world. As midnight approached, the passenger gathered his core team for a final briefing before the return flight to San Francisco. The screens around them displayed a world still buzzing with activity. Markets in Asia were opening, European analysts were publishing their first in-depth responses, and social media never slept. "Tomorrow," he announced, "everyone will try to replicate what we did today. They'll miss the point entirely. He gestured to the forgotten red cap, still tucked away in his briefcase. This wasn't about creating a controversy or causing a distraction. It was about understanding how information flows in the modern world, and then turning that flow to our advantage. The terminal staff, who had maintained their professional composure throughout this extraordinary day, began preparing for the late-night departure. They moved with the quiet efficiency of people who understood they were part of something historic, even if their role was simply to serve coffee and maintain order. Outside, the Texas night had turned cool and clear, a stark contrast to the stormy morning in San Francisco that had started it all. The passenger security team began their final preparations for departure, but their role had evolved. They weren't just protecting a person anymore, they were guarding the architect of a new approach to corporate strategy. As the lead flight attendant began her pre-flight checks for the return journey, she reflected on how much had changed in just one day. The morning's apparent crisis had been revealed as a masterpiece of corporate strategy, but it felt like something even bigger had been demonstrated, a new understanding of how reality itself could be shaped and directed in the digital age. The passenger took one last look at the array of screens displaying his strategy's global impact. The funny thing is, he mused to no one in particular, everyone will remember this as the day we pulled off an incredible merger. But what we really did was prove that in a world where everyone thinks they can see everything, the best move is to give them exactly what they're looking for, just not for the reasons they think. The Gulfstream G650 soared through the dark skies back toward San Francisco, its cabin now quieter than the eventful morning flight. The passenger sat in contemplative silence, watching the city lights far below while his team continued monitoring the global aftermath of their extraordinary day. The lead flight attendant noticed how the aircraft's atmosphere had shifted from the morning's theatrical tension to an almost philosophical calm. "Sir," one of the team members approached with a tablet, "you might want to see this." The screen displayed a live stream of a prestigious business school's emergency evening lecture, where professors were already analyzing the day's events. They're calling it the attention arbitrage, using perceived controversy to mask real corporate strategy. The passenger smiled slightly, taking the tablet to watch. The cabin's soft lighting reflected off its screen as experts debated what would surely become a legendary case study in business strategy. "They're missing the bigger picture," he said quietly. This was never just about business. The security team's phones continued buzzing with updates from around the world. Markets in Asia had opened with unprecedented activity, European analysts were publishing their first comprehensive takes on the strategy, and social media had evolved into a complex web of meta-commentary about perception and reality in the digital age. The most interesting response, the passenger observed, scrolling through various reports, isn't from the business world at all. It's from the cultural theorists and philosophers. He showed his team a particularly thoughtful analysis that had just been published. They understand that today wasn't just about executing a merger, it was about demonstrating how reality is constructed in the modern world. The lead flight attendant, serving a final round of refreshments, noticed how even the passengers' team had evolved throughout the day. The same people who had started the morning managing a seeming crisis were now engaged in deep discussions about media theory, crowd psychology, and the nature of truth in the digital age. As they crossed over the Rocky Mountains, the passenger gathered his core team for what would become known as the Mile High Reflection, a conversation that would later be cited in numerous books about business innovation and social theory. "Everyone thinks the lesson here is about misdirection," he began, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet cabin. "They'll try to copy the strategy by creating their own controversies. But that's like trying to copy a magic trick without understanding the principles of illusion." The team listened intently, many taking notes on their devices. The forgotten red cap, still tucked away in his briefcase, had become more valuable as a historical artifact than any piece of clothing had a right to be. Museums had already reached out with acquisition offers, seeing it as a symbol of how perception could be manipulated in the digital age. The real innovation, the passenger continued, wasn't in creating a controversy or even in executing the merger. It was an understanding that in an age of absolute transparency, the best place to hide is in the spotlight. He gestured to the dark landscape passing below. Everyone was so busy analyzing what they could see, they forgot to look for what they couldn't see. The security team's leader presented a final set of analytics for the day. The numbers were staggering. Social media engagement rates had broken records, market trading volumes had hit historic highs, and the merger had been completed with unprecedented efficiency. But the most interesting metrics weren't about business at all. Look at these conversation patterns, the passenger pointed to a particular graph. See how the discussion evolved? From outrage to speculation to revelation to philosophy. We didn't just complete a merger, we gave the world a lesson in how reality works now. The team studied the data, seeing how their carefully orchestrated performance had sparked a global conversation about truth and perception. The lead flight attendant, preparing the cabin for their eventual descent into San Francisco, reflected on how the day had changed her own understanding of the world. She had witnessed not just a masterclass in corporate strategy, but a demonstration of how reality could be shaped and directed in the age of constant surveillance and instant communication. As they began their descent, the passenger made one final observation that would be quoted in countless books and articles. "The world thinks they witnessed a brilliant deception today," he said, looking out at the approaching lights of San Francisco. "But what they really saw was the truth about how our world works now." Sometimes the biggest truths hide behind the most obvious distractions. The Gulfstream G650's wheels touched down at San Francisco International Airport under a clear night sky, a stark contrast to the stormy morning departure. As they taxied to the private terminal, the passengers' team was already receiving reports about the next day's newspaper headlines, all struggling to capture the full significance of what had transpired. The terminal staff, different from the morning shift that had witnessed the start of this extraordinary day, had no idea they were greeting the conclusion of what would become a legendary case study in corporate strategy and social manipulation. They simply saw another late-night arrival of a private jet. Before disembarking, the passenger turned to his team with a final thought. "Tomorrow, everyone will try to analyze what we did. They'll write books about the strategy, create frameworks for replicating it, and teach courses about the mechanics of attention manipulation. But they'll all miss the most important lesson." He picked up his briefcase, the red cap still inside. In a world where everyone thinks they can see everything, the real power lies in giving them something obvious to look at while the real story unfolds in plain sight. The lead flight attendant watched as the group departed, knowing she had witnessed something that would be studied and discussed for years to come. The red cap controversy that had seemed so important in the morning had been revealed as just one layer of a much deeper story about power, perception, and the nature of truth in the digital age. As the last of the team left the aircraft, the passenger paused at the door. "The funny thing is," he said, looking back at the cabin that had played host to this extraordinary performance, "everyone will remember this as the day we changed how corporate mergers work. But what we really did was show how reality itself works in the modern world." The red cap was never the story, it was just the lens that helped everyone focus on exactly what we wanted them to see. With that, he stepped out into the San Francisco night, leaving behind a day that would be remembered not just as a masterclass in corporate strategy, but as a moment when the curtain was pulled back on how reality itself is constructed in the age of digital media and constant surveillance. The red cap incident had ended, but its implications for business, media, and social theory were just beginning to be understood.